What's up, y'all? Y'all are listening to Living Corporate's flagship podcast. If you didn't know, Living Corporate helps organizations build employee engagement and market trust through data analytics and data transformation, our e-learning platform, and brand marketing storytelling. We're so excited for you to be here today. The conversation you're about to hear is going to connect the dots between employee experience and go-to-market effectiveness. If you're not ready, get ready. Here we go. Dr. Derek Black, constitutional professor, really working at the intersection of course, constitutional law, public education, author, writer, again, researcher. Man, I want to say how you're doing, but I'm going to selfishly say first, Dr. Black, what the hell is going on with this Trump administration? We had you on right before everything kicked off, and it feels like it's been complete pandemonium. Talk to me about what you're seeing in this landscape right now, please.
Yeah, it's a different day every day of the week, which I guess goes without saying, but there's a little bit of schizophrenia, to be quite honest. And, we'll have executive orders coming out on one day that, make enormous exertions of power, right? Power that doesn't exist. And then we'll all get freaked out and say, I've never seen this before. I can't believe this. And, we can talk through some examples if you want to. And then the next day they'll issue another order that says, well, do everything within your power, to achieve X result, which is an implicit recognition that there's a limit to their power. And so, the simpler way of saying this is some days they show no boundaries and other days they do. And it's just completely unpredictable. It's sometimes I wonder who's really running the show at these various departments. It's like, sometimes it looks like interns, sometimes it looks like professionals. And it's really hard to wrap your mind around what's going on a day-to-day basis, to be quite honest.
When we last spoke, something that stuck with me, right? Some of the themes that came out of our last conversation, again, just a couple months ago. And truthfully, Dr. Black, you might be the fastest return guest we've had in a long time. I was just
That's like, a bad thing.
It's just I was expecting to have you back like next year. I was expecting to have you back in like 6 or 7 weeks. Yeah. But as I think about the conversation that we had, a couple things that stick out to me was one that we talked about the fact that like the government is really big. So making large sweeping changes, effective changes, is hard. Especially, we were talking in the context of like the Department of Education for public education. But then we also talked about the fact that you can't really dismantle the Department of Education without the Department of Education. Like the way it's set up, the complexity of it, it's not like you can just sign a piece of paper and it goes away. Two things there. First of all, and you've alluded to it kind of like in your opening piece here, but it's like, it does feel like there's been these huge sweeping changes and there's all these things that are happening. And some of them seem to be kind of being checked by the courts and there's things being just determined in that nature. But then we also are seeing like this administration continue and do what it's doing anyway. And then on top of that, we are seeing the Trump administration seek to shut down the Department of Education. Like, I guess I say this to say, how much of what is happening right now is within your expectation? Because I know we talked about expectation setting and like, hey, there's going to be chaos. Like, as someone who sat in this space and an expertise of constitutional law, like, how much of this feels like, hey, I'm in a place where I feel like I can really speak to everything that I'm seeing, and then how much of this is like, hey, no, this is actually beyond the pale, even for what I've studied my entire career.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely things that have come along that I did not expect. So let's, maybe sort of bring other folks along, sort of think about what was within the realm of expectation, and then what has sort of happened. So, you expected, fireworks. Oh, we're going to shut down the department. But I said, look, there's limits to what they can do. You expected that they would talk about, anti DEI stuff, but there's limits to what they can do. But there was this part of me that kind of thought that there would be certain rails, certain guardrails that would hold things in check. And so the question is, where have we gone further? Well, on one level, true to my initial thoughts, they're acknowledging they can't just shut down the department. And I thought, so we'll just say we're going to do it. We'll have some press conference, and that'll be that. What I never expected was that Elon Musk would be empowered so much in this administration to scare people off from work, right? And so what they're really doing is exercising a soft power. They can't shut the department down. They can't just fire everyone they want to, but they can make life scary for people such that they say, for my own sanity, I just need to move on. And they seem to be very effective at that, right? Just sort of so much chaos that people can't take it. And so, there's a lot of folks at the Department of Education that have taken buyouts. Of course, there were a lot of contracts canceled. That was also something I wouldn't have anticipated. I mean, generally speaking, if you have a contract, you've got a lot of clients and a lot of professionals that follow you. You got a contract. You expect you're going to get paid. You don't expect that just sort of midstream for no reason those will be canceled. So where they could, they went after contractual relationships. And that's not something we normally think about with the Department of Education so much. The sort of contracts that it has, the Institute for Education Studies, which has a lot of contracts to sort of collect data and things. So those things were canceled, not something I ever was thinking about. And then, again, I expected a lot of, big talk about, DEI and this, that, another. I didn't actually expect that they would issue guidance that was entirely contrary to the law. It's sort of like, there was this dear colleague letter that came out telling schools that, the only thing you can do around, and the only way you can consider race and diversity is if you're remedying past discrimination. That's it. And if you do more than that, we're coming for you. Well, I mean, that's just not what the law says. And so that was a little bit disturbing to see a document that claimed that the Supreme Court had done A when the Supreme Court had really done B. At the same time, what was surprised me right after that was that, they kind of stepped back. They sort of backtracked from that initial statement. I was part of a group of a dozen or so law professors that issued this memo to all the university general counsels that said, hey, this guidance out of the department is completely wrong. And we listed the very specific ways that it was wrong. And to my surprise, a week later, the department issues a second guidance that kind of, backtracks on some of their prior misstatements, which makes me think, again, are professionals running this place or are interns running this place? But then I feel like I'm like just a run-on sentence here, but then just a couple of days ago, in fact, on Friday, the Department of Justice and Education, said we're freezing $400 million for Columbia University, and that one maybe shocked me more than any of them, in part because there is a process by which you terminate funds. There's a process by which you withhold funds. And, I pulled out the federal, regulations and was reading them to some of the reporters that were calling me. And I just said, look, even the schools that had segregated Black students, throughout the 20th century, when we finally started pushing them to desegregate in the 60s, even they never faced such swift and unilateral consequences as did Columbia University last week. I mean, that's a remarkable statement, that recalcitrant Southern school never faced as swift and unilateral as punishment as Columbia. Why is that? Is it because we loved the segregationists? No, it's because there's a process. You have to investigate what's going on in the school district. You have to present to the school district your findings. You have to then make a request of them as to how they might voluntarily come into compliance. And then only after 3 more steps of them refusing to come in compliance would you actually terminate their funds. If you look at the history of the department, you can count up on your fingers and maybe a couple of toes the number of times that the department has actually terminated funds, because once presented with the facts and the threat of federal funding loss, school districts always cave. Universities always cave. And sometimes these findings are news to them or there's some dispute, but they cave. And here what happened was, I don't think Columbia, I mean, again, I don't have all the facts. I don't think Columbia ever got a statement of factual findings of here are the things you've done that violate Title VI. And I don't think they got an opportunity to course correct and come into voluntary compliance. And to be clear, I'm not defending Columbia if, in fact, they were creating a hostile environment for Jewish students. But what I'm saying is, even if they were, this isn't how the process works.
So it's interesting. First of all, thank you. And thank you for your numerous examples, because I believe underlying all of that is this, and to your point about the swiftness and the manner in which even that grant was withdrawn or taken away. I believe it seems at this moment, Dr. Black is speaking to just a rejection of historical administravia, right? There's just a rejection of process, and it almost seems as if, and I do want to talk about Columbia a little bit more for obvious reasons, so we're going to get back to that. But but earlier you talked about, you alluded to Doge, Elon Musk, and his frankly control of the federal government. It seems as if because the government, and we talked about this last time, it's so big, it just moves really slowly. But you have all these new actors here who don't move like that. They move more like a VC. They're just going to move really, really fast. So my concern outside looking in, right? Not a professor, not a studier of the Constitution, not a lawyer. It seems just as if the federal government is outmaneuvered. They're being outpaced. And yes, we're seeing every day I'm following different journalists who are tracking, judges' decisions and motions and all these different things. But my concern is that these actions are happening so swiftly and just so abruptly that it's overwhelming the system, where certain harms cannot even really be remedied, right? So with USAID, that's been a whole thing, right? They tried to block spending and funding and made a bunch of unilateral decisions, just came back and blocked the effort, they put what's the word? They put temporary restraining orders and all kinds of things. But that didn't really stop the fact that a bunch of people around the world have already been impacted. So what do you say to, and if the reality I'm painting is overly bleak or wrong, correct me, but what is the solution to that? Because I don't really understand how we solve that.
Yeah, I mean, first let me just say how much I enjoy talking to you, which is why I came back, because I feel like you give, I sit in my, ivory tower and you kind of forget about what, how are folks interpreting this, and what about regular life, and it triggers ideas that I don't normally have. But first of all, let me see if I can put it all together. So first, you're right. I mean, what we have is a venture capitalist mentality brought to government. Government is not supposed to run that way. Venture capitalists can terminate units, fire people, close things down. There's no rules that stop them. The federal government operates on the Constitution, due process. I mean, you can't just cancel someone's contract without affording them notice of why, an opportunity to respond, and some third party to help, make the the decision legitimate. Same thing about firing people. Now, there are these temporary employees. For folks that were noticing that temporary employees don't have the same due process rights, but for all the others, they do, right? And of course, there's free speech rights of universities, right? You have the DEI administrators and faculty and other folks saying, hey, look, you can not fund some things, we suppose, but you can't tell us what we can and can't say. I mean, this is still America, isn't it? And so there is this sort of very, very quick moving apparatus that is treating government as though it is business. And look, there's a lot of people out there that say, hey, business, government needs to act more like business. And look, we can always be more efficient, but business is fundamentally different than government, right? I mean, business doesn't actually owe us anything. We don't have a relationship with them. We don't vote for them. We have no accountability unless you're a shareholder over them. And to be quite honest, if Ford Motor Company goes under tomorrow or Apple goes under tomorrow, the world will move on. Android will step in or something, or Google, whatever, right? You can, go buy. Yeah, who cares, right? If the United States government goes under, or if your Social Security check doesn't arrive, if your kids don't have, free lunch at school, that they used to, like all these things, right? These are fundamental aspects of governance. There's no one to step in. There's no one that can do that job. And so I think that's on one level, the disturbing part of this. I get the desire for efficiency, but this is kind of like Humpty Dumpty. You break it, you don't just put it back together again, or there's not some other person to step in, and you're leaving families and real lives in the lurch. You talked about folks overseas that are depending upon aid, and again, it's not just about those folks overseas. I mean, we've had representatives say, hey, you guys think you're making America strong and you're stopping waste, and that all you're doing is sort of cutting off whatever countries we're funding. But guess who produces the corn and the food that they use that USAID funds on? It comes back to America, to American farmers. And so again, to go back to the business sector, right? I mean, if you're in business, you may not really care what happens to your competitor, because maybe that all comes back to your benefit. But that's not the way the web of government works. So, even when we think we're cutting off our enemies or our third cousins, what we're really doing is cutting off our brothers and sisters here at home at certain times. So all that's very distressing. But the final point, which you had really triggered me to think about, is that our government and our Constitution, our laws operate on a very large degree of good faith. Like, we don't have so many courts that they're just always there to sort of fix bad actors. We don't have rules that really govern some of these discretionary areas, that we rely upon the Congress to respect the president to respect Congress, and the courts to respect them, and for all of them to respect the people. But when people stop respecting, right, they have the ability to abuse to extreme lengths, and there's not a real good check on that, right? And that's the part I think that really matters for regular Americans. I don't know how many regular Americans I know or but I think that when we go to the ballot box, or when we have gone to the ballot box over the last decade or so, that we go to the ballot box with the impression that we can just try out things, that we can just try out change, or that we can experiment, or that the consequences of a bad decision are relatively low. And that, to some extent, was pretty true 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, I'll say right now, which might be shocking to some people, that, I didn't vote for Mitt Romney, but a Mitt Romney presidency is not something that Americans need to have feared in their guts. Would there have been consequences? Absolutely. Right. Um, the difference, to be quite honest, between an Al Gore and George Bush presidency there would have been a difference there, but it would not have been um, one that changed danger levels, stability levels. And so I think the long-winded point that I want to make is that when you see this type of change happening, you see these type of guardrails being blurred, you really have to step back and say, is this about, should I be voting based upon policy, or should I be voting based upon the stability of the way of life that I know? And look, that's pretty rich for a person who's got a decent job and decent life to say, and hey, Professor Black, you're not living paycheck to paycheck. No, I'm not. But I do think when I look outside my window or I read the news, I understand that on some level, we are all in the same boat if we break Humpty Dumpty. And that's the part I just think people don't get. And I understand they don't get it, right? Our public education system didn't do a good enough job with civics. Our media doesn't do a good enough job with civics. Our politics don't do a good enough job with the common ground. And as a result of that, we are playing with fire right now as a people, regardless of party, when we just, are willing to vote for anyone who says something that sounds appealing in the moment and might work. Might work.
You know, I so a couple things. I think that one, I agree that this system of government is built upon a certain degree of gentility, and the this administration in this moment is proving that it's built upon a large part of bit of that, and that the minute that disrespect is lost and that there's an assumption of hostility and outright fascism or authoritarianism, then things start to really bend at the seams and in some ways break. I think, like, to your point about the civics um, literacy, you know, I think our problem. I saw somebody tweet this recently. Is like the issue is a lot of people who taught us civics were also like the coaches, and so we weren't like we didn't appreciate that. And I think I grew up thinking that okay. In fact, I remember distinctly in 10th grade as we were understanding or ninth grade, we were talking about the three branches of government, and I remember walking away thinking, "Wow, the presidency is okay, like it's all right, but really, it's about Congress and the judiciary." Like I was like, the presidency is like more representational. It's more It's not wholly ornamental, but they really are genuinely executing, right? They're executing upon the laws that Congress makes. Yes, they can do some executive orders, but those things are like for emergencies, and frankly, like Congress can override those things too. Like there's things that can be so. The point is like it's just interesting to see like in this moment, all these things be flipped on their heads. The second thing is, to your point about us all being in the same boat, I'm not really a big fan of F around and find out like the attitude of that, like laughing and sneering at other people, because it's like, hey, yeah, you're laughing at this person who voted for Trump and like they lost their job and whatever, and it's like, I guess you can chuckle at that for a couple minutes, but like that person is a citizen here, like they live here, and like they share the same resources and experiences that you do. Like I think there's this lack of appreciation for the fact that we are in a connected system, and that's everybody, right? Like I think like there's a lack of systems thinking across the board. Like we're seeing Trump and them are clearly not systems thinkers, because if you were a systems thinker, you wouldn't cut off U.S. aid and then fail to understand why then like BRICS continues to rise in power. You wouldn't like you you just wouldn't do certain things because you recognize that literally everything is connected. But let me ask you about like enforcement. So what practically stops the Trump presidency or any president from just being like, I'm gonna just do what I want to do, because like the U.S. Marshals report to the president, right?
God, you're not throwing out these these constitutional crisis stories I tell my con law students. I said it goes to the heart of what we're talking about. I say, what is the rule of law? The rule of law exists and has meaning really only in the hearts and minds of the people. And I'll just give you the perfect example. You talk about the U.S. Marshal. So we've got the Supreme Court, we got Congress, we got the president. Let's assume that the president violates the law. Maybe he murders someone on Pennsylvania Avenue. I don't know. He goes back to the White House, and there's a prosecution, there's a call for his arrest, etc. Whatever it may be, goes with the Supreme Court. Supreme Court issues an order to have the president appear or whatever it is, and the Supreme Court is 9 people with a handful of Capitol Police. So they put a document in the hands of Capitol Police, or maybe the U.S. Marshals, who also deliver, these judicial orders. And they walk over to the White House and they knock on the door and they hold up this document and they're allowed into the front door. And they keep getting closer and closer, and they get to the Oval Office, and the Secret Service is standing there, and they say, you can't come in. The president has said you cannot come in. And they hold up a document and say, well, here I have an order from the United States Supreme Court. It's valid under the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. What happens at that point? The answer is it depends upon, probably they're going to call general counsel, right? Probably the Secret Service are going to call general counsel. And then the general counsel is going to tell Secret Service, hey, that's a valid order. And whether they let those folks escort the president out of the White House depends upon whether the rule of law lives in the hearts and minds of the Secret Service.
Dr. Black, that is crazy.
Well, I don't know if it's crazy, but it just says, and this is about the faith that we're talking about. Like, we didn't used to have to worry. We used to believe that people would follow the rules. As I tell folks, Nixon could have resisted. Nixon could have tried to not leave, and then we would have saw whether the rule of law would bend or break, or whether it lived in the hearts of men and women. But we didn't have to, because when the Supreme Court issued its order telling him to release the tapes, because it lived in the heart of Nixon, he said, okay, and he stepped away. But when men and women in the executive branch don't say okay, there's no one that can, they are the police. They are the FBI.
Dr. Black, that don't scare the shit out of you?
Well, look, I was on another podcast a few weeks ago, and he said, you're a pretty optimistic guy. What would signal the end of democracy for you? And I said, the president of the United States refusing to comply with a direct order of the Supreme Court. And, so we go back to the executive orders that I was talking about at the top of this show. There are numerous instances, at least with the Department of Education over the last month, that if you read them, it seems like they got up on the side of the bed that says we believe in the rule of law, because they direct their officers to only do things within their legal power. But then you come the next day and they just terminate $400 million, for Columbia. And it seems like that day they got up on the side of the bed that said we can do whatever we want to. And so, those days are scary. Those days are disturbing. Those days I'm often at a loss of words, because what more can I say? Obviously the rules and regulations don't matter on those days.
Let's talk a little bit. Let's just get even more depressing, because why not? And I'm gonna be honest with you, Dr. Black, this is scary. It's scary to me, but I'm gonna keep going. Before I get to my next question, let me just I'm gonna name it that. That's scary as hell. That essentially, these are all just constructs, right? Like, legality is a construct, right? It seemed like and I've been thinking about this actually more and more. And this was not the point of this pod, but I'm thinking about this more and more around, like, the murder of that United Health CEO, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people are like, okay, Luigi's a murderer. And it's like, okay, you look at the function of private insurance, and they showed all this documentation history of insurance denying claims and things that like led to people dying, and like that being a core element of business. And like, it's like, okay, so there's one, so corporate like this in a corporate capitalist context is good business, but then like this individual action is illegal, it's murder. And even like the shifting of it, and it seems like the more it really, I believe this season is showing me, right? And it's not that I needed to be, I mean, look, I'm a black man in America, and I got a little bit of bread, but I'm not like super rich. I am privileged, but I'm still a black man in America. Is that what we deem as crime and illegal gets grayer and grayer the higher up in the hierarchy you go. You know what I'm saying? Because why like, I think it's weird that we're having discussions about Doge at all. The entire thing is unconstitutional. The entire thing is illegal, right? Like, and like one could, and this will probably come out like in 18 months, but one is going to eventually do the analysis and understand that the actions that Doge took to cut off U.S. aid and shutter U.S. aid did lead to people dying around the world, right? And so it's like, hey, that if an individual who wasn't worth billions of dollars did this, it would be a crime. So anyway, rant over.
To your point, though, actually, I mean, I hadn't sort of thought about it till you put it that way. I mean, because now we have persons outside the jurisdiction of the United States. But I mean, it is plausible, as you say, that there will be causes of action for the deaths of persons if they can sort of fit those into our constitutional constructs. I mean, because that's another just little piece of the puzzle here, is that, the rule of law, as you said earlier, government and the court, they can't keep up with the pace of what's going on. And as someone remarked early on in this, like, the president is writing checks for other people to cash right now, right? So, I mean, so what if you violate the Constitution? We actually do have a process for that, right? I mean, people, state and federal actors have been violating the Constitution since the beginning of this country, and we bring them into court, sue them, but normally there's a consequence for the political actors who do that. Normally maybe it's at the ballot box, maybe it's in the public opinion, and then ultimately it's the Treasury, the coffer. So the American people will end up paying for the attorneys and the damages of a lot of this, but the current occupant may be on his way out the door or already gone by the time it happens. And again, this is another problem with a system based upon good faith, which is, if you're the president and you really just don't care, then I suppose there are no consequences, because the consequences fall upon us as the people, not the president.
Okay, so 2 follow-up questions. Okay, so you're not. I don't believe you're saying it this way. You can look at the people behind me, Kwame Ture, like James Baldwin. Like I'm inspired in it, like by more people driven initiatives. My practice is a little bit different, but so I don't think you're saying it this way. But I do believe ultimately, like, it will come to like the people having to rise up and fight if we have to, and like demand, because like, it's scary in this moment, Dr. Black. It seems as if these major institutions, and I'm not saying that, like, again, I'm looking at the notifications, and I know you have way more information than me. It looks like the courts are working in triple overtime. Like, it's like they are super duper busy. Like, I told my wife, I was like, yo, they have to be up like all day and night, like handling all this paperwork, because like I'm seeing these like circuit judges everywhere are involved in something, right? At the same time, when we see Congress fail to move in the ways that we want, like, it feels like, it's like, are we going to just repeat France? Because like, what else is going to happen? Like, to your point, like if the president don't care, and I would say this is probably, and like I'm only 35, but in my lifetime, it seems to be the most shameless president I've ever seen. Right? Like at a certain point, do you anticipate like a rising up of the populace? Like not going to town halls or not like tweeting really angrily. Like, do you see like massive protests and a storming of the state? Not, and again, not January 6th style per se, but like a true revolt. Like, what do you like? Do you see things getting there?
Well, I mean, we've certainly over the last couple of weeks seen, people coming out to Republican town halls and confronting them. Now, the Speaker of the House says that these are paid protesters. I don't know the truth or the falsity of that. But I mean, people have got to make their voices heard. But I also think that the people have to understand these dynamics of the separation of power too, because just to back up for a moment, I mean, one of the reasons why we have gotten to this point is because voters expect presidents to do things. I mean, you said earlier correctly that like, well, it's really about the Congress, and then, the court's making sure that we're following the rules. The executive is just supposed to execute them. But, if you look back, and I'm going to lump a lot of presidents into this. We have had a continual expansion of unilateral executive power. Let's just back up to President Biden for a moment. Maybe I talked myself out of a job, and that's probably a good thing. But, they wanted to know, and people were having conversations, can we just cancel student loan debt if, we can't get Congress on board? And they knew that they couldn't get Congress on board. And I said, look, I'm sympathetic for those students. I teach them every day. They're paying way too much. They've got loans they're unreasonable, et cetera, et cetera. But no, you can't just cancel their loans. Like the president does not have that power. And, and I've told this to my students, it's not about what I think is good policy. It's about what does the president have the power to do? And what the president did, and I published a piece about this before it went to the courts. I mean, the president asserted the authority to basically double the financial responsibility of Congress with its discretionary funding, and Congress didn't have a say in it. I mean, that is not how government works. The president just said, you know what, I'm going to write a check for $1 trillion for a good thing. That's not how it works, right? And I won't bore people with other examples, but part of what's happening, that's the voters are demanding the president act. Now, why are the voters demanding the president act? Because Congress has done almost nothing for the last 15 years. The only things of major import that our Congress has managed to pass are in moments of absolute crisis. The Great Recession, the TARP bailout funds. And even then, those votes were close because a lot of Republicans, well, they weren't that close when George Bush was president in his final months, but when President Obama came in, incredibly close, right? And we could go through other examples. And so voters are hungry for solutions to immigration challenges that we face. Voters are hungry for solutions to the rising cost of housing, healthcare and other things, right? They're desperate for climate change sort of progress, and Congress refuses to deliver. So I kind of get it. I get the emotion that people say, well, I'm just going to elect a president. He better do something. And that's what presidents have been doing. But that's actually the path that gets us to the point where we can elect a president that just says, you want me to do some stuff? Okay, well, watch me, because I'm really going to do some stuff. And it's really just, it really is a shredding of our constitutional system that I think, a very large percentage of voters, Democrat and Republican, are complicit in. And it's because, again, they are valuing these immediate short-term results over the long-term stability of the society that we have.
So one follow-up to that, and then my last two questions. Okay, so follow-up is, outside looking in, as someone who is, I would say I'm pretty leftist. All right. It's interesting as we look at the history of rising executive power, outsized in the relation of the three branches of government, that rising executive power, Dr. Black, happens to best be mobilized when enriching the billionaire class. Right? So like, because you're like, I hear you, and constitutionally you are right, obviously. The fact, hold on, pause everybody from me telling Dr. Black that he's right about something constitutionally. Ridiculous. But I said it anyway. Yes, Biden didn't have the right to outright cancel student loan. And yet, like, previous presidents and Biden and Trump haven't had the right to do all kinds of things. And yet they happen, and they seem to happen with much more ease when it comes to appeasing and or enriching a very, 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 very 99 more times small group of people in America, right? Or enriching other actors overseas. And so, my hope is, I don't even know how I have no pun intended, I have the audacity to continue to hope that there will be some sort of understanding in this moment by like working class people that we're going to need to organize, mobilize, and demand of our elected officials and one another something different that can actually help us. Now, we're coming up on time. Let me ask these last two questions, get you up out of here, because I'm going to tell you, these last two questions...
You're triggering fantastic ideas. I'm not going to let you ask your next question. Because again, I mean, I love talking to you. You just make me, take another look. So I actually think there's a little bit more nuance to what you're saying. And it is that actually the executive doesn't have to act with unilateral power for the billionaire class, because the billionaire class buys Congress. They can actually get laws through, right? And so what we're talking about with the student loan waiver, for instance, is benefiting the regular folks. It's not benefiting the billionaire class, right? It's driving. And so what we really have are these populist revolts. Sometimes they're Democratic, sometimes they're Republican populist revolts. And, we, the people, aren't buying Congress. All we can do is vote, right? So what we try to do is encourage the president to just do stuff for us, I suppose. And so it really is, it really made me think that, right, the real problem here is that the people cannot control Congress with the way the system is working and the money is working. And so they are resorting to these sort of ulterior expectations. But, the billionaires, they get what they want, I mean, look, the Affordable Health Care Act, which has been a cultural problem, like that happened not because regular voters were demanding it. It happened because the insurance companies wanted a system whereby they're going to get paid for everybody to have insurance, right? And so a lot of the individual mandate, all these little pieces and puzzles that I teach in common law class, they're there because that's what the insurance companies wanted to be there, not because regular people were demanding it.
Fair. And you're right. Like, that's a super fair point, that rarely, if ever, does the billionaire class have to worry about petitioning one person to do something, because they kind of control everything. So, or at least heavily influence everything. All right. Last two questions. There's been continuing to be talk, and right now it's being considered as some fringe theory or fringe idea. But I think it's as closer and closer as this term ends, we'll see it continue to raise up more prominently, is Trump running for a third term. What would need to happen for that to not, like, for all of the people who had coaches as civics teachers, what would need to happen to stop that? The Supreme Court, right?
Well, I mean, obviously the Constitution doesn't allow it. So but it's like, given where we've come in this conversation, like, well, what difference does that make? I mean, look, it would require a constitutional amendment. That's not going to happen, because it would take 3/4 of the state to ratify it. So I'm not too worried about it being legal. If he then puts his name on the ballot, or tries to put his name on the ballot, he would be ineligible to serve. And so officers should remove his name from the ballot. Now, I will say that some of my students will go, well, wait a minute, but didn't he engage in felony um, and he still stayed on the ballot? Didn't the 14th Amendment prohibit that? I mean, well, the Supreme Court said that, that the way it, we'll just say for lack of a long conversation, the way that it rolled out, that you couldn't have individual states unilaterally making these factual determinations. But as I point out to my students, I think the third term is a lot different. If my son wants to run for Congress, he'll go down to the Board of Elections. He'll put his name on there, and he didn't even have a driver's license yet. He'll show him his learner's permit, and they'll look at his birth date, and then they'll say, well, we're sorry, we can't put you on the ballot. You're not old enough. And he can't say, put me on there anyway. I deserve a trial, or da 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 da. So these basic facial qualifications are things that local board of elections can just exclude you for. Whether Trump, engage in insurrection, maybe that's a more complicated question. Lawyers make things go. So, I mean, to me, it just seems to me that people acting under the rule of law and believing it in their hearts and minds would simply say, look, I can't put your name on the ballot, Mr. President, because you're ineligible to serve. I mean, it's just clear. So I think the bigger danger would be his just refusal to leave office. Yeah.
Okay. So follow up is, when you say his refusal to leave office, because there have been some other political scientists who've also predicted the same, that he won't leave until he dies. And so, like, what would that practically mean? So he'll just be like, hey, we're not having an election. It's not safe, or I don't trust these, blah, 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 blah.
Well, look, if he did that, it comes back. I mean, I kind of had the silly example of a Supreme Court sending some sort of order over because he committed a crime or whatever. But I mean, at this instance, I mean, if there's a duly enacted, I mean, let's assume we had the elections. Let's assume that he lost the election. Let's assume that Congress. Well, if his name wasn't on the ballot, they'd have to certify it for someone else other than him, either Democrat or Republican. So in that scenario, I kind of find it hard to imagine FBI, Secret Service agents saying, we're not going to let the new occupant in. I can't imagine that scenario. I think the more realistic scenario is somehow or another, the certifications don't happen in Congress because the president uses executive authority to seize the voting machines like he wanted to last time. So we don't get a result. All right. We don't know what the final results are. And therefore it is difficult for those states to send in electors to Congress and for Congress to certify one. I mean, this is a more realistic and therefore scarier type of example. But I mean, that I don't know. I mean, even that is, I mean, it makes for interesting conversations. It's hard for me to imagine, because I'm so naive and a person of relative good faith, to think that a president could seize or electoral machines, particularly if he wasn't even on the ballot himself. I mean, it would be the most blatant power grab you could have, because normally what happens with autocracies is that they retain power by running sham elections. So what he really needs is a sham election. What he really needs is for himself to be on the ballot, even though the Constitution doesn't allow it. So that would require a lot of people at the state level agreeing to go on with that sham. And now we're back to that same point earlier. Is the rule of law broken enough and enough hearts of Americans that you could concoct at least a 25, 30 state strategy to have a sham election? I don't know. I'm not so pessimistic about the American people to think that could happen. If his name was legitimately on the ballot, right, as it was last time, can I see funny business going on. Yeah, because that's happened in history before, in plenty of elections. So I shouldn't say plenty, in some of our elections. But putting a man's name on the ballot that's not supposed to be there, I don't see how you do that transparently under the light of the sun that we currently live under. But again,
I'm going to take you at your word. All right, last question. As we're recording this, we talked about Colombia earlier.
Well, let me back up. Actually, I can't because you're pushing. What if there's a national, some sort of concocted national emergency in the election?
That's what I was going to ask. Right. Yes.
Yes. That's and we've seen this in other places. Man, I don't know how Americans go for that, right? I mean, look at the COVID election, right? I mean, COVID or no COVID, a lot of people wanted to go out and stand in line and vote.
Absolutely.
Or are. So, I mean, I feel like you do that. You talk about that mass sort of revolt. There are going to be millions of people standing out the boards of elections offices demanding to be allowed to vote regardless of what the president of the United States says.
So we were talking about Colombia early this conversation. Recently, we have Mahmoud Khalil, the graduate student, Palestinian activist, who was essentially like disappeared, collected by ICE, and was on his way to be deported before, at the time of this recording, a federal judge stopped it. Mahmoud does not have a criminal record. As I'm looking and seeing like the evidence of him supporting terrorism, it's him being anti-war. Now you're a little bit. I'm not calling you old, Dr. Black, but you got more gray than me. All right, dog. So here's
you just got your hand shorter than me. That's
fair. No, fair call out. Fair call out. And so there's this there's like this cyclical nature to history that's really concerning to me. One, I want to hear your perspective on the act. I mean, you saw Speaker Johnson actually just came out and said and essentially stood by it. Right? It was like, yeah, First Amendment, but still, who cares? It was the long and short way of it. I actually said it way swaggier than he does. Very corny person, but I want to hear your opinion on it. But I think going back, just like this cyclical nature of history, you have like in the 60s and the 70s, the 50s, and earlier than that, the Paul Robeson time, during like the times of Paul Robeson, people who were loudly anti-war and pro-peace or like anti-imperialism more specifically, historically have been deemed as some sort of communist or terrorist or national threat. We continue to see that. It seems to be more ramped up now than maybe it even was then, more naked and obvious now than maybe it was back then. Do you see this as part of like that? I mean, like even like, I mean, there were people who were protesting the Vietnam War who are seen as terrorists and seen as counterinsurgents and all these different things. Like, I'm curious, like, how do you see this moment in the meta narrative of like First Amendment, free speech rights? And then, of course, I'd love just to hear your perspective on Mahmoud's situation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a shout out to my colleague Wadia Saeed, who's done a lot of work, over the last 20 years on, the federal statutes that allow people to, or allow the government to declare people, sponsors of terrorism. And so, he's written a lot about, he's the son of Edward Said, one of the sort of, foremost scholars of the history of the world on this subject, former professor at Columbia University. But what Wadia talks about is how, with some of those statutes that were passed in the aftermath of 9/11, that they very broadly define what terrorism is and support what they call material support of terrorism. Now, and I haven't read every word of his scholarship, but my recollection was never that mere exercise of First Amendment support of ideas would have been declared terrorism, that it was often, you gave a sandwich to someone who was a terrorist, or you donated money to some organization that gave sort of clothing and medicine that somehow or another indirectly. So, he sort of pointed, a lot of people got, brought into this dragnet. And, I'll say I'm not familiar enough with the facts with the young man you're talking about to say, what they're even alleging about him, much less what he may or may not have done. But I mean, the exercising of your free speech rights doesn't violate any federal statute regarding terrorism that I'm aware of. We had some, going back to times of Robeson and others. I mean, there were these standards about clear and present danger that were articulated a century ago, saying like, look, the only way that you can punish people is if their language in this area is clear and present danger of incitement of violence, basically. And so, absent that, you say what you want. You can say what you're supposed to be able to say what you want about these issues. You also asked about how I connected to the longer history. And in my new book, Dangerous Learning, which is about the war on Black literacy, but it's also the war on ideas. And that was the part that really hit home for me the hardest when I was writing Dangerous Learning. I mean, the book starts out as sort of my personal passion, love affair with the story of people's fight for freedom through literacy. But then I sort of stumbled my way into all this censorship of the media, of textbooks, not just of what Black people could read and write, but what white people could read as well. And so the South in particular became a region in which anything that was even perceived as being contrary to the status quo of slavery was declared seditious and illegal. And to be clear, it wasn't always that way in the South. I mean, that was part of what I really learned in this book or in researching this book, was there actually was a fair amount of diversity of thought in the South. Not just between enslavers and non-enslavers, but also even amongst some people who enslaved others. So North Carolina, for instance, in 1829 had 1,200 members of the Anti-Slavery Society. The idea that an anti-slavery society existed in North Carolina in 1829, much less that it had 1,200 members, was shocking to me, right? These other stories of people who had enslaved others, but were directly in opposition to the repression of literacy, because they said, look, it's our duty as Christians to share the word. And one guy got himself run out of South Carolina, had enslaved lots of people, but he said, look, this is my Christian duty. I don't care what the law says. I'm going to continue sharing the word and literacy and reading and writing. And if that brings the end of slavery, then it must be God's will. I mean, this is the words of a slaveholder. The point of all this is we have this diversity, right? Virginia debates the abolition of slavery for 6 weeks in 1831 after Nat Turner's revolt, because people finally go, there were slaveholders that said, look, we can no longer make a deal with the devil. This state will never be safe so long as we enslave people. We have to find a way out of this. Of course, we didn't find a way out of it in the 30s. And since we didn't find a way out of it, the thought police began to come in, right, to censor what everyone is seeing and thinking and saying. The mere possession of a book, of certain books, like David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, merely possessing that in your home was a crime, right? And so I say in the book, the South sealed its fate in the Civil War, not when the first shots were fired in 1861 at Fort Sumter, but in the 1830s and 1840s, when people could no longer disagree with the party line, when people could no longer speak freely. Now, I'm not saying we're heading for civil war in America, but we are heading towards a society in which, if we're not already there, you're not free to speak anymore. You're not free to have this conversation that we're having. And what kind of society much less a democracy. I mean, that's not democracy. That's not a world I think any of us, D or R, should want to live in. And so, yeah, there are echoes of the past, these sort of moments. I mean, I focus on, those in the pre-Civil War era, and you're asking about others. We've had these moments before around free speech, and I think how we handle the freedom to disagree really determines whether we still continue to have a democracy or not. And we have made it by the skin of our teeth a few times in the past.
Skin getting real thin, Dr. Black. But listen, it's always a pleasure having you here. You said a couple times, and I'm flattered that you enjoyed conversing with me. I enjoy speaking with you as well. I look forward to having you back soon. I'm going to be honest with you. Dr. Black, I don't want to see you back here for at least another 2 years. All right?
That's what I tell folks. Don't want to talk to you anytime soon.
I want to talk to you. I don't. Man, I'm going to tell you, y'all don't know. Something happened. First of all, there were so many things happening. I was genuinely getting overwhelmed. And I know that really is kind of like the point of all of this. But so many things that happened. I think finally when I saw Linda McMahon talk about the fact that when she was not really being committal on anything, I was like, all right, I gotta hit up Dr. Black. Listen, the most recent book, Dangerous Learning. Make sure y'all check the links in the show notes and learn more about Dr. Black, the work he does, the research he does, the writing, authorship that he does, as well as some of the work that he's doing and mobilizing with other lawyers to make his voice heard. So he is actually leveraging his power, position, and privilege to do something. And I hope that everyone listening to this figures out and identifies the localized ways that you can also leverage your time, talent, and treasure to do something to help your fellow neighbor, your fellow neighbor, your fellow American, because we're all in this thing together. Dr. Black, we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Well, no, not soon, but we'll talk to you again.
So relative, everything is relative. Peace, man.
All right. Talk to you later.
Our logo was designed by David Dawkins. Our theme music was produced by Ken Brown. Additional music production by Antoine Franklin for Musical Elevation. Post-production is handled by Jeremy Jackson. Got a topic suggestion? Email us at livingcorporatepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us online on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and living-corporate.com. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned.